Hello crafty friends, I'm Lien from Studio Kato and I'm so glad you're joining me again today. Today I have a super fun technique for you guys that will give your stamping an entirely new look. And the only special supply you'll need is white pigment ink, and most of you will already have that in your stash. This technique is super simple, and I want to say right from the start that you definitely don't need a stamping tool for this. The only reason I am using a stamping tool is that my next layer of stamping, so not the white I'm stamping now, will have a lot of different colors, and sometimes that doesn't work quite as well from the first stamping round. So I like to stamp that twice. Now I'm stamping the first layer in white pigment ink, but my white pigment ink is very wet, so sometimes it pulls up a little bit, and I'm just smoothing that out with my fingers. I don't mind getting my hands dirty while crafting, so I often use my fingers for things like this, but you can also use a sponge dauber or a blending tool, anything that works for you. Now, because I'm using my Misti, but again, you don't have to, I can just turn my panel around and then stamp the next corner. And I will fill the other ones later. And now I'm using dye inks. I'm using the Concord and 9th inks, but you can use any dye ink you have in your stash. And I have offset my panel just a little bit. I moved it down a little bit and a little bit to the left as well. So I'm not stamping in the exact same spot that I stamped the white ink. An edge of the white will show and an edge of the green won't overlap with the white. Now I'm using a bunch of different fall colors to stamp these leaves. I wanted this to be super colorful, and that definitely worked out. I just love fall and all the colors that are associated with it. I can't wait to make more fall cards. I feel like it's finally time. Now you'll have noticed that I'm working on craft cardstock. This is the Neenah Dessert Storm cardstock, and I really like it for this technique because it's not too dark. For shadow stamping, you don't want super light paper, but you also don't want super dark paper. I find this is a very happy medium. And the way it works is basically you stamp the first layer in white pigment ink, which will be very bright on dark cardstock because pigment ink is pigmented. It is opaque, whereas dye ink, the second layer you're stamping, is not opaque, it's transparent. And that means the color of it is affected by the color of cardstock or ink underneath it. So anything I stamp on top of the white ink will show up the true color of the ink. Anything that is stamped slightly off that white ink, so on top of the slightly darker cardstock, will be slightly darker because it's affected by the color of cardstock underneath it. And then gives you that fun layered look, that fun shadow look. Now I also stamped the stems of these leaves. I just used an acrylic block for that because that was faster. And I stamped those in Versamark ink, and I can emboss them with Wow Gold Rich Pale embossing powder. I'm also adding splatter, of course, but when you're embossing, make sure that your panel is completely dry. Especially pigment ink stays wet for a really long time, and all of your embossing powder would stick to it. So before I stamped my stems, I first heat set this panel, then let it dry for another 30 minutes, and then heat set it again. And even then, there were still some spots that weren't completely dry, so make sure you check your panel. Now once my splatter is also completely dry, I sped that up too with my heat tool. I can center on my sentiment. This is a really large, bold sentiment by Crafty Meraki. It's from the Thanks Slimline tag die, and it just cuts out this word thanks in one large piece. And I cut that from the background, but I also cut that 4 times out of thick white cardstock. And I layered those layers together, that's what you see here. And to give it a nice touch, I am adding gold, the same gold I use as a splatter, around the edges. You won't see this when you're looking at the card straight on, but if you tilt it just a little bit, it will show and it will be a really nice detail. And the gold I'm using here, by the way, is what I used for the splatter. It's a fine tech gold metallic watercolor. I'm just gluing the background onto an A2 size top folding card base, and I'm using Barely Art Precision Craft Glue for that. And once that's in place, I can glue the thanks that I cut from the background on top of my layered thanks sentiment. I really like this Eclipse die cutting technique because apparently that's what it's called, because it doesn't take away anything from your background and it gives a really cool effect, especially if you add a little bit of color to the edges of your die cut, like I did with the gold here. And once that's nicely stacked together, I can add some more glue to the back of it and simply inlay it into my background. It fits in super easily, again, because this is a large and bold sentiment. This would be harder to do with a smaller one. I also saved all those little inside pieces. There aren't a lot of them with this die, and I'm just putting some glue in the openings of the die, and then I can add them in with some craft tweezers. Now my planned card was finished there, but I thought it was a little bit plain and it just didn't feel complete to me. And what I like to do then when I feel like that is just add a frame. And for this card, I chose to use the same gold paint. I'm using a lot of it today, but I really like gold in my fall cards as well. And I'm just free drawing on a simple frame that is slightly smaller than my thanks word. And this really adds a nice effect as well. Now with this straight top-down view, it's really hard to see the gold painting. I think you can see it a little bit better here, but I will also show off this card by tilting it a little bit so you can see all the little details as well. Now, of course, I am also making a matching envelope, and I'm using some thinner craft cardstock for that. I'm just folding an A2 sized envelope with my We Are Memory Keepers 123 punch board, and then gluing it together with the Barely Art Precision Craft Glue. Now I am going to add some stamping to the envelope, and the only reason that it works, even though it's glued together, is because this is fairly thin cardstock. If you're using thicker cardstock, you might see some edges in your stamping because of the edges in the paper underneath what you're stamping on. Now, I am keeping this a little bit more simple, and I am just using the colored inks. I am not using the white pigment ink for this. I like decorating my envelopes, but I also like to keep things a little bit more simple on an envelope design, because in the end, not a lot of people keep the envelope, so I'd rather spend some more time on my card instead. I am also adding the gold embossed stems of the leaves on the envelope, so I'm just stamping those in with Versamark ink, and then I can emboss them again with Wow Gold Rich Pale Embossing Powder. I really like that embossing powder because it's sort of like an antique gold. It's not very bright or yellow. I really like it. It's more subtle than a lot of the gold embossing powders I've used before. And that's it. My envelope is all done, and so is my card. I really like how these turned out. I am a sucker for a fall card. I'm a sucker for fall. So I'm happy to be making some cards for the season. And of course, I hope you like it too. If you did, make sure to leave a like on this video and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to read them. You can also subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of my videos. And make sure to follow me on Instagram and check out my blog. The links for those will be in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.